Hey, what's up, guys? Lil Man with a Big Opinion here. So, I've got a news update for y'all, and I almost feel like I'm just repeating myself over and over and over again. And, you know, the my suggestions are, they're staying the same. I see, you know, basically every video that I talk about something news related and then mention the word World War III. It seems like it is, drops in a bucket that individually on their own, it's kind of like a whatever situation. But if I were to go back and look at every single video that I did, and, you think about all the new stuff that you hear, it, you know, I think I say it every time, it seems like things are getting a little spicier. So, let me know in the comment section down below what you think about this, if I'm just, you know, talking crazy here. But, those of you that do comment, I enjoy reading them, and, you add some more insight to it. And I think this kind of channel, we're mostly on the same wavelength. If you like this kind of stuff, subscribe, hit the like button, do all that sort of stuff. So the meat and potatoes of it is the U.S. fired on a Iranian ship trying to run the blockade. This goes after a 6-hour, basically turnaround, or we're going to, make you turn around by force. We gave them a warning saying evacuate your engine room because we're going to knock it out. That way you can't continue to try to run this blockade. And then we sent guys on board and, took the boat over. Iran saying, don't do that. Other people around the world, there's mixed feelings. We're being told that the cargo was probably linked to China. And, they're using a term that I hadn't really, thought of, but after they say it, it kind of makes sense. That it was dual purpose materials. Essentially, what that means is, yes, this stuff going in could be used in the commercial market. It's for civilians and, it's just economy stuff. But it could also be used on, the warfare side of things. It could be going for the government, and, like someone was pointing out, certain electrical components that could go into a computer or it could go into a drone. I think of, almost everything falls into this category. You could technically say steel is dual purpose. This steel could be going to building a building, or we could use it to make, tanks, missiles, whatever. I'd make the same argument about food. Food could be going to civilians for them to eat, or it could be giving the calories to a military guy so that he can fight better. So it's a very broad used term. And, if they're linking it to the Chinese, and that tosses in another factor. Some people are saying that Russia is sending stuff. This whole fuel issue and surrounding energy, it's definitely disrupting, way more countries. And, in Europe, they're talking about jet fuel shortages, and, Australia's talking about increasing, LNG exports. They're been posts about, hundreds of empty ships coming to the United States to fill up with oil. I saw one headline that said the U.S. is almost at the point where they're exporting as much oil as we did during World War II. And, if you compare it to that, and that's the only thing you looked at, that would make people go, oh, dang, this is serious. Um, you kind of back up a little bit and, you think about, global implications. And, I'm seeing stuff where more and more countries are, pushing, nuclear being built, more solar, more wind, more battery storage. And, this is across the board everywhere. India is doing it more in like a grassroots approach. Individual homes are buying solar, so that's lowering, the national demand. Places are talking about, firing up closed coal plants. More people are buying solar. It's energy is definitely, playing a huge role in things that are going on right now. And, it makes you think back to, the U.S. going into Venezuela, the strait being closed. And, I'm a history teacher. And it's one of those things where, you're really not going to know until, 30, 40 years from now. And they say, yep, this is what we define as the starting moment. I think back to World War II. Generally speaking, the U.S. says World War II starts 1939 when Germany invades Poland. Because that got enough people involved or enough countries involved to, claim it as a world war. But, then you backtrack, the regional conflict between Italy and Ethiopia, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. I've never really heard people push it all the way back to Japan and Russia getting involved, but that kind of sets the stage for, Japan to go into China and, do stuff. And, it's one of those things where, you look at regional conflicts going on, today. The biggest thing that you can think about is probably Russia and Ukraine. I toss, China and Taiwan on that list. I would toss, domestic issues happening in countries, especially with, all of this, migration happening in places and, lots of internal conflict. Most people kind of gloss over the Spanish Civil War going on right around the same time period. It was a possibility. There was a good probability to it that Spain could join the Axis. Um, I think about Sweden and Norway, providing materials. Some of it was a little bit of occupation. They were providing stuff before Germany went in and kind of verified, with troops, hey, we're going to make sure we're keeping getting this stuff. And, you throw all of this in the mix. There's definitely a bit of nationalism. I'm thinking back to World War I. The main ideas: military alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. there's massive nationalist movements going on all over the place. There's nothing wrong with thinking you're better. You know, I think we've kind of avoided stuff with sports. I was talking to, students at school about the US beating Canada in hockey. That's almost like fighting a war. That's their sport. We went in and we won. At least this go around. The militarism. You know, countries all over the world are spending more on their militaries. A lot of it is, more from a defensive standpoint. A lot of it is, kind of posturing. We're building X many number of, more tanks, more this, more that. So, the writing's on the wall of, hey, don't mess with us. We're gearing up. Several countries are, Germany passed the law where if you're between the ages of like 18 and 30, 18 and 25, I don't remember the age range, but military age fighting men, they basically told them you have to get permission if you're going to leave the country for an extended period of time because they want to make sure they got enough of these dudes at home in case, something happens, we can rapidly increase the size of our military. The US increased enlistment age. I think it was by like 7. I'm pretty sure 37 is the cutoff unless you have some sort of waiver. And they increased it to 42. You toss all of this in the bucket. Let's say, the conflict happens when you end up with 100 pounds. And we're tossing 1 pound in at a time. We have dozens of pounds in there. And there's no real way of knowing, what item is going to be the last pound that, really sets things off. There's no way of knowing until, 40, 50, 60 years from now if, if nothing else, pops up, countries start doing more negotiating and, treaties and stuff gets signed. We'll talk about this in history as, here's a conglomerate of, regional issues that, kind of sorted themselves out. Or if, our grandkids are going to be saying, yep, in, the early 2020s, Russia invades Ukraine, and it starts out as a regional issue, and, 6 years later, here's majors and minors, and, this is who are allies with Ukraine, and this is who's allies with the Russians, and, we really don't know. Finland fought a war with Russia by themselves. A peace treaty was signed. And then they kind of helped the Germans when Germany attacked. They never really, sided with the Germans, but it was more like we have a common problem. So, we're going to attack this, separately, but at the same time. And so, you toss all these things together, the main news thing is we took someone else's boat. And, we're saying this supplies had a probability of being used against us militarily. What this, could mean is a lot of things, but several people are saying there's enough stuff going on between enough countries that the next global conflict, has started. It's in its early stages. There hasn't been, major declarations of war, but, chess pieces are moving. And if you look back at history, as much as I love World War II stuff and the battles and the war in Europe and Pacific, um, I wrote my thesis paper about the home front and everything that happened. Not everything. My specific focus was women in Texas and California, and you know been out of college for a good bit now, had more time to read more stuff and learn more things. And we are not situated the same way we were before. It's a mixture of, you know, interlocking markets and, not really knowing exactly what, you know, we don't know how things are going to be affected on the home front. We can make very good educated guesses, though. With the way technology is, we're going to be much, in my opinion, much more greatly affected than we were in either previous World War. And dozens of people have talked about, what this can possibly look like. I think probably one of the scariest things to think about is someone on a computer somewhere else can mess with parts of our infrastructure. And we don't really have a good, security system set up to prevent that. Uh, the simplest thing that I've always, heard and talked about is, water treatment. Someone can type some stuff on a keyboard and, now your water is not safe to drink. Whether that's, reversing the flow of water and, you're backing sewage up into people's homes, changing, the chemical ingredients that makes it drinkable. Um, and that's considered simple stuff. You know, I even think about the process of, they turn something off. We have water pipes break all the time. Since living in the town that I live in, there's been, five or six. I know of one very strong one because it broke in my front yard. And I mean, they had it fixed in like 12 hours or less. But what went into that fix was also, shutting down part of the system and, them having to flush water through it to repressurize it. And that just adds more time. And that's just one big key aspect. We flip out when we lose power. It's not just for the simple stuff like heating, cooling, and, being able to do stuff. Food going bad, and, you spend good money on it. You don't want it to go bad. But it's also the other technology stuff. I was playing Battlefield. In my free time, I like playing a good video game. Losing access to power or the internet during a time period where, son's taking a nap, I've got everything else done, and I've planned this to be relaxing time. If I can't play my game, I get frustrated. I'm a little irritated. Multiply that by tens of millions of Americans. Losing, your de-stressor. That's not, it's not going to kill us. Some people think it's a lot bigger of a problem than others, especially, you get more addicted, that sort of thing. But, any change from normal, and I think we'll see a lot bigger change from normal this go around. With how interlocked trading is, we went and picked the dewberries. They're finally coming in. Had a really strong winter, a very, very mild start to spring. And, we've picked a couple containers worth. They last us, sometimes they last us a couple of days because, we pick them and we eat them. By the end of the month, they're basically going to be gone. They will have gone through their full cycle. They've ripened. We've picked what we could. The animals have eaten what they could. They've come and gone. But I can go to Walmart, get dewberries, they're blackberries, basically every single day of the week. A lot of them come from Mexico, other parts of South America, and it has, almost made us fat and happy that we can go in and just get, just about whatever we want. There was a time in our history where if it was out of season, you didn't consume that thing. And that's going to drive a lot of people crazy. If, simply thinking a supply chain shortage on, any stuff like that. We produce a lot of stuff in the U.S. I don't think we'd exactly go hungry. I think a lot of us could do with, going without certain things for a certain period of time. It'd probably be beneficial to our health. But it's getting away from normal that, I'll say the other, popular word, Civil War. It reminds me of Hearts of Iron. You've got, your support percentage and your war support percentage. And so, your country can support you on one thing, but really not, your war support can disappear. Whether that's based on losing battles or, there's just a lot more people, a lot more opinions, and, depending on how things go, your, support goes up and down. It's happened with every single president. Having a certain number of people that agree with you, it can be at 60% one day and 40% the next day and 50% the next day and down to 30%. All these individual actions. And I think any deviation from normal is going to cause people to not like you. We can take gas. Fuel prices have driven support up and down for every president for decades. I could say I was fairly happy with the current administration when I was getting diesel for $2.60 a gallon. It stayed like that for a couple of weeks. I remember when they came in, it was, I think I was spending like $3.60, $3.75. And, it got down to below $3. And regular gas, where I live was under $2. Not trying to brag. I know different regions in the U.S., it's higher and lower. I'm in Texas, somewhat close to, all the refineries in Houston. So our fuel was cheaper. I have family that lives in Oregon, family that lives in Illinois. Fuel prices never got as low as ours. But, the family that lives in Illinois is in the same profession as me. They make a little bit more, thinking about cost of living. The point is, the national average was very, very low for several weeks. and it was continuing to go down. The most that I've paid for, like, I've seen diesel over $5. I got it yesterday for $4.89 because there was a little bit of a dip. And, I'm glad I've got my electric scooter that I can ride to work. There are people that were very, very happy with the current administration based on fuel prices, and now they're going up, and they don't like them as much. You can, I can say for every president that I've lived under, I've been able to find at least one thing that I really enjoyed about them, and one thing that I really disliked about them. It comes down to, you kind of, I'm a simple minded person. I chart the stuff out. If there's 7 good things and 6 bad things, they're a bit better. I don't think any one of us, it's a possibility. There's probability in it. But no one in good conscience can really say 100% of this was terrible or 100% of it was great. And so, that sentiment is there, and that's getting away from normal, and that's going to cause a lot more issues. I would highly recommend, it's out there on the internet. Look up victory gardens. Now we're at the point of the video where, I say the same thing that I've said a bunch before. What am I doing to try to, mitigate current things going on? What preps am I adding? What skills are we developing? What are we doing to make things stay as close to normal as we can as things start to get terrible? I made my short. I recorded my chickens for 10 seconds. We started putting some of them in the run. They're about 11 of them are 7.5 weeks old. One of them is 2 weeks older because, the family friend that we got them from, the one that's older was supposed to go in the last batch. They thought it was a rooster. It's not a rooster. She's big enough that she can't go through the chain link fence that we have for the run. The other ones can definitely fit, and so they're going to have to stay in the coop for about a week. But we got 12 chickens. I thought I was only getting 10 when I showed up. He had more that survived the process. And when I said 10, it wasn't hard to convince me to do 12 because 11 of them are all roughly the same age, and one, just a couple of weeks older. And, doing the math on that, those chickens should produce about 14% of our caloric intake for a whole year. Now, that's worst case scenario where we're going to consume every single egg that they make every single week. But that's eating a ton of eggs. But we've got the freeze dryer. Once we, consume the eggs in the week that we want to consume, we're looking at, glass storage, or, cooking them and freeze drying them. Also looked at, we have a 70-pound dog. She can get a couple of eggs a week as a supplement to, her kibble. My grandparents' dogs can get a couple eggs a week. So we're nowhere close. We probably won't, especially living in town, be able to hit 100% of our food needs. But that's putting a little buffer there. of, self-sustainability, and it's going to help me, put food aside. And it's a nice little springboard. Like, people talk about being self-sufficient. Chickens are like one of the first things on the list. That and the garden, and I think we're getting closer to that 25% mark. Maybe 20%. But I would rather produce 20% of my food needs than 0%. And, then we go into, the ties that we're building in our community. I got these 12 chickens for $50 at 8 weeks old. Tractor Supply is selling, their 2-3 day old chickens, and they're $5 a piece. So, like, if Tractor Supply were going to sell 8-week-old chicks, they would probably $10-11 a piece, if not more. The person we got them from, they have close to 100 chickens. So, if we needed more production, more food, whatever, we've got this really good family friend that knows we have a freeze dryer. I've freeze dried some food for them. And, we are stronger together. Increasing water storage, increasing, the amount of food that we have in our working pantry. That's baseline. Buying more ammo. I think every prepper wants to hear someone say, you can buy more ammo. Prepping is, kind of sophisticated hoarding. What's better than 100 rounds of, 9mm? 200. What's better than 200? 250. You can apply that to basically everything of prepping. What's better than 50 gallons of water storage? 75. Any number that is higher is better. So, the 2 liters of soda that I drink, I've been rinsing the bottles out and filling them up. I'm still, deciding if I really want to do it, but, Facebook Marketplace. I found some of the 275-gallon IBC totes. They're food grade. The guy has 8 of them. I get paid in a few days. I am strongly considering purchasing one of the totes, going ahead and getting the gutter stuff and setting up the rain catchment system, and, making that my May preps. Because it's a fairly significant investment. It's juggling do I do the water storage? Do I put more money aside to get the, the WWIII system do I want? It's almost like I need to get one of those little envelope things, and I assign money to each little project. But, life still happens. The car payment still needs to get paid. Utilities still need to happen. You got a 2-year-old. You need to live life some. He's really into Spider-Man right now. So buying him a Spider-Man toy is awesome. That's another, big part of this channel is, being a budget prepper. You would see a lot more videos about gear and stuff if there was more dollars to toss around. But like I was saying, this comes down to numbers. $10 worth of prepping, even if it was over the course of a month, is better than $0 of prepping. $50 is better than 10. That number can go on forever. $1 million of prepping is way better than $500,000 of prepping. It's a marathon, and every little bit, adds to that. I didn't buy it recently or anything, but I have this knife sitting here. It's a fairly sharp knife. I got it from a coworker that knows that I'm into scouting, and she didn't have a use for it. It's an old case knife. I didn't need it. I've got dozens of knives, and some knives are better than others. Some knives are made for different tasks and things like that. This is just a good, solid knife. Getting this one, let's say I had 10 knives before. 11 knives is better than 10 knives. And that's the problem we run into doing this. I hope through other videos, explaining that, 20,000 rounds of ammunition is awesome. And it's definitely going to help in, certain SHTF situations. Maybe, it's controversial. I like my firearms. I like going pew pew. Maybe you stop at 10,000, put some more rice and beans aside. You hit goals with some of this other stuff. I'm gonna add this IBC tote before I go buy more AR ammo. And that's not what we want to hear, because the AR stuff is fun. It goes pew pew. But there's so many categories to this. The one that I've been doing a lot of work in that is not completely free, because I do various things for this, but that's my own physical health. And every single person watching these videos could probably, focus on that as well. I have a scratch on my face. No, that's paint. Which is awkward because I spray painted something on Sunday for my grandmother, and I went to work today, and I guess I didn't notice it. But, if you can only do 10 push-ups, depending on your physical ability, age, whatever, 11 is better than 10. I was very, very active today. I got 37 minutes of physical activity according to the old watch. And for some people, they would look at, and so it's calculated, as long as my heart rate's over 125, it counts as a physical activity minute. I think 125 to 135 is moderate, and above that, it gets vigorous. I don't remember exactly what it means. But some people look at that and say, wow, you're over half an hour. That's a lot. There's other people that work out twice a day. That's their warm-up and cool-down time. But, there's a huge difference between a 10-minute mile and a 9-minute mile. 9 and an 8. Even a 7:55 versus an 8. So, any amount of improvement in that category. There's hundreds of ways to measure that, because there's so many different categories of fitness. I watched a video today of a bodybuilder doing calisthenics with a guy that does calisthenics. And, he's doing some sort of move where the bodybuilder, clearly very physically fit, but he couldn't do that movement. He didn't have that level of core strength, even though he looked shredded with six-pack abs. I've watched videos of power lifters and Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs are, tier 1 operators. And, one Navy SEAL deadlifted 515 pounds, but the power lifter, beat him by like 200 pounds. Measuring it that way, the bodybuilder is better than the Navy SEAL. But you toss him in the water, that SEAL's probably going to swim laps around him. You know, the guy that does sprints in high school, you know, the I say high school, it's anything really. The sprinter that does the 100-meter sprint is probably going to beat the 2-mile runner every single time. Lots of explosive energy, stupid fast, probably fairly physically fit. Then the 2-mile guy, he's going to finish his 2 miles, minutes ahead of that other guy. So, you got to keep it simple. Very basic levels of fitness. A push up, a pull up, a squat, and a mile run time. And then, planks or sit ups or something to do with your core. Stick with, let's say you stick with those 4 things. Let's say you don't even focus on the core because you're technically in a plank doing the push up. Set a time of 1 minute or 2 minutes, or just as many as you can do, until you're fatigued. If you're doing 5 push ups, then your goal should be that number needs to be anything higher than 5. The squats, whether it's body weight and you're counting reps or you're squatting some sort of weight. Whatever your maximum level is, you need to work on making that number go higher. The 1-mile run. I don't care if you're running a mile in 20 minutes. Any goal under that 20 minutes, any number that is less than the 20 minutes is better. The scouts have to do a mile and then work out for 30 days and do the mile again. I was very happy with all of them that they decreased times. The biggest time difference I saw was 2 minutes. And I was like, wow, good job. If you're comparing it to competitive levels, their mile time was awful. But there was improvement, which means what they're doing, they need to continue to do to continue to see levels of improvement. And I talked with the scout. We had one that improved their time by 12 seconds. Their time was much closer to being something more competitive. I think he was running, his one today was like a 7:15, 7:16. He's not in track, which I told him he should run track, because that time you're doing way better than, you're probably running faster than the football players at your school, which is a cool thing to feel. But, sometimes the improvement is measured in seconds. If at the start of the month it's 10 push-ups and at the end of the month it's 11, gains are being made. If you're looking at, percentages of muscle and body fat, if you lost, 2 pounds of body fat in a month, awesome. If you lost 2 ounces, awesome. If your muscle gain, same numbers, 2 pounds, freaking awesome. 2 ounces, 2 ounces is better than 1 ounce. 1 ounce is better than half an ounce. You get so minute that, gains are gains. Decreases in times are decreases. Increased rep or increased weight, that's why they make weights in so low of an increment. Everyone likes to, up it in the 5s and 10s and 25s levels. Sometimes putting that 2.5 pound plate on and adding 5 pounds, that's the difference in, first place or second place in a lot of things. There's hundredths or tenths of a second differences in 100-meter dashes. Any level of improvement on your physical fitness is better than absolutely no improvement. If there are things decreasing, then you need to reevaluate what you're doing. Talk with friends, family, people that understand more of this. It might be going to a professional, but I think YouTube's a really good place for that. And there's hundreds of different strategies. There's probably tens of thousands of people that are offering advice, tips, tricks, all that sort of stuff for free. You can spend money. It really just depends on your goals. Um, you know, Workout equipment can be $0. You're just using your body and the stuff that you have in your house. Whether it's, push ups, sit ups, squats, you've got stairs, you have something heavy you can pick up. And it's like everything else with prepping. You can spend $10 a month or you can spend $10,000 a month. Just work on that improvement. So that's the advice part of this. It hasn't changed. I'm still adding food, still adding water, still trying to get physically stronger. If we're improving 0.1% each day, we're still improving. So, one last time, because holy cow, we're at 47 minutes. Subscribe, like the video, dislike it, leave your comments, but most importantly, share this with every single person that you know. Because the more people that are being prepared means an easier time of staying close to normal. The closer we can stay to normal, the better we weather whatever the problem is. But that being said, I'll catch you on the next one.